Hi, everyone. We're going to get started now. Welcome to part 2 in our professional learning series on Native Americans in New York. For those of you that didn't meet me yesterday, my name is Caitlin Holt, and I'm the Manager of Education at Brooklyn Public Library's Center for Brooklyn History. Today, I'm joined by fellow BPL and Brooklyn Museum colleagues, who you will meet throughout the program. The objectives of our session are to share the history of displaying Native American works and the challenges found therein, and to take away lesson ideas for understanding bias in history, as well as strategies for engaging students with Native American histories and cultures today. Participants who successfully complete the session will be able to submit their information for 2 CTLE credits upon completing the evaluation survey at the end of today's session. You can follow our agenda and access today's supplemental materials in the digitized session booklet shared in advance via email, as well as through a link that should be posted in the chat shortly. Those of you that attended day 1 will recognize this as the same booklet shared with you yesterday, but if you continue to scroll through it, you'll find all the details for today's session as well. Before we get started, I'd like to share some housekeeping instructions. Again, apologies if you were with us yesterday, you've already heard these, but it's always good to revisit them. First, and I promise this will work today, we would ask you to please change your pronouns, or I should say, please add your name and pronouns to your profile so we can identify you. This will be especially helpful today because there will be opportunities to work in small groups and breakout sessions where you'll be able to interact and speak with each other. So it'll be really helpful for us all to know your name and preferred pronoun. You can do this by clicking on the participants icon at the bottom of the window. Find and hover over your name in the participants list on the right side and click more and then rename from the options provided. You can now edit your name and add your pronouns. For instance, they, them, she, her, he, him, she, they. You get the idea. You'll notice that we've muted all participants in order to prevent unintentional audio feedback and disruptions during the program. Therefore, we strongly encourage you to use Zoom's chat feature to share your ideas, comments, and questions. Staff will closely monitor the chat and be on hand to provide technical assistance, offer clarification, and/or respond to concerns. We'll also use the chat feature to share resources referenced in the presentations and to collate questions for the various Q&A portions of today's session. You can access the chat feature by clicking on the chat icon at the bottom of your window. We are committed to ensuring all of our events, activities, and materials are accessible to all individuals, including those with disabilities. Therefore, captioning is available during today's session and can be enabled by clicking on the CC closed caption icon on the bottom of your window. And if you have any additional accessibility requirements, we hope that you'll email us at connections@bklynlibrary.org. Today's session, because it is closed caption, should have a transcript. So if that is something that you need, please reach out to us and we'll be able to confirm its availability. And on that note, we want you to be aware that this session is being recorded and it will be shared after the session concludes. So by participating with your camera on, you have consented to being recorded. If you do not consent to being recorded, please turn off your camera and refrain from verbally sharing any ideas or comments or questions, which shouldn't be a problem because we have you muted anyway. You can share these questions and ideas through the chat feature, as I already mentioned, which will not be saved. And our breakout sessions will not be recorded. So in that instance, it's totally fine to have your camera on. All right. Now I'm going to visit our code of conduct. Our events are intended to create a space that nurtures a community of educators that is inclusive to all, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender identity, religion, age, sexual orientation, ability, or stage of professional development. All attendees are expected to show respect to presenters, organizers, and other attendees. This event will contain discussion about issues related to race, bias, and oppression that can be difficult to talk about. As an attendee, you may at times feel uncomfortable with the issues and opinions shared. If you find yourself struggling with the topic of discussion, it is appropriate to walk away from your computer and take a break. It is not appropriate to respond by sharing hateful ideologies, racist language, or confrontational viewpoints. Hateful or racist behavior will be considered a violation of the code of conduct and result in an immediate expulsion from the event. We ask that you actively listen, be sensitive to the anxieties and concerns of your fellow participants, and show support for one another. Again, please reach out if you need help with anything. Use the chat feature. You can also share with us privately if you have any concerns about a participant's behavior. You can privately message staff through the chat feature. Just look for somebody with the name co-host next to their name and message them privately, and we'll handle it. I would now like to introduce my colleague, Molly Seegers, to offer today's Land Acknowledgement. Molly is the museum archivist at the Brooklyn Museum, where she has worked since 2016. Her experience in archives, libraries, and museums spans over a decade, with stints at the MoMA Library, the Fashion Institute of Technology Special Collections and College Archives, the Frick Art Reference Library, and the Rockefeller Archive Center. Molly graduated from Haverford College with a BA in sociology and received her MS degrees in library and information science and the history of art and design from Pratt Institute. Molly was a lead collaborator on the Brooklyn Museum's current exhibition, Jeffrey Gibson, When Fire is Applied to a Stone, It Cracks, where she facilitated research and copy edited content and didactics. So I'm going to hand things over to Molly now to give our land acknowledgement.
Thanks, Caitlin. The Brooklyn Museum and Brooklyn Public Library stand on land that is part of the unceded ancestral homeland of the Lenape, Delaware people. As a sign of respect, we recognize and honor the Lenape Delaware nations, their elders past and present, and future generations. We are committed to addressing exclusions and erasures of Indigenous peoples and confronting the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism in our work. And now, Jen and Julia will be kicking us off with an activity. Jen Hoyer is an educating librarian with Brooklyn Connections. She has previously worked as a librarian in school libraries, public libraries, and research libraries in Canada, and spends her spare time volunteering at Interference Archives. Julia Pelez is a Brooklyn Connections educator. She holds an MA in teaching history from Bard College and previously worked as an educator at the American Museum of Natural History.
Okay, hello everyone. So thank you, Molly, for that introduction. So today we're going to have a lot of conversations that revolve around historic bias and colonialism. But before we delve into those conversations, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page vocabulary-wise, because that's a really important aspect. So in order to do this, we're going to do a quick vocabulary icebreaker, right? So I am going to be reading out some definitions from the slides, while Jen actually opens up a multiple choice response in a Zoom poll. You're going to have about 20 seconds to select your definition. And after the activity is over, we're going to talk about how we can differentiate this activity for your specific students. So let's begin with our first definition. The first definition states, when the writer, creator of a source is strongly slanted towards or against something, i.e. an event, person, or regime, because of the context they live in, making the source unbalanced, prejudiced, and one-sided by using positive or negative language and/or the omission of facts. Okay, so you guys were right. A lot of you said that this was historic bias. Great job. So let us move on to our next definition. So this definition states, the point of view that the creator of a source is taking in order to explain a historic event, time period, or person. Since everyone sees and experiences the world differently, people write, think, teach, and interpret historical events differently. Okay, so this definition is lived experience. So let us move on to our third definition. So the definition states, used to understand the time period which one is studying. By using an array of primary and secondary sources, one can start to piece together the event or time period in question. Okay, so the answer is evidence. So let us move on. So the next definition states, to explain the meaning of an event, action, or information. Okay, and the answer is interpret. So we only have a few more words to go, but you guys are doing great. So let's move on to our next definition. So the next definition states, the social, political, cultural, economic, and environmental factors and situations that influence historical events. This helps researchers understand the environment that a historical event was created within. Okay, so the answer is historical context. You guys did really great on that one. So the next definition states, a socio-political and economic phenomenon whereby various nations exploit, conquer, religiously convert, settle, and kill people in order to control and occupy their lands and lives. Okay, so this is colonialism. Now, this is a very important term that we're going to be spending a lot of our event actually touching upon. So great job. Only a few more to go. So the next definition states the different ways in which groups of people interact with one another, in which one group exerts power and force over another. Okay, now this is power dynamics, and all of you got this right, so great job. And last but not least, the last definition states, the representation and explanation of experiences and choices of a group of people or an individual that focuses on knowledge gained through these experiences. Okay, and this was perspective. So before handing it over to Molly, I just want to take a moment to talk about how you can take this activity and differentiate it for your specific students while still incorporating these important terms and creating engaging teaching materials for your students. So last year, when we actually did this professional development in person, we took these vocabulary terms and put them on stickers where our participants worked in small groups and they were able to stick the vocabulary terms and match them to their correct definition. You can also set up this activity as though it was a game show along the lines of Jeopardy. So you're still incorporating these important terms into your classroom, but again, you're mixing it up. I will say that one of our moderators will be posting the lesson plan with these vocabulary terms in the chat later on. So please don't worry about getting your hands on these terms. You guys will get that in the lesson plan later. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Molly. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Jen and Julia, for that activity. And thank you all for being here. I'm excited and honored to have the opportunity to speak today. And I'll admit to being a little nervous because I have a lot of admiration for your work as educators. I also want to say that I'm appreciative of my colleagues and co-presenters for all their tremendous work in making our program possible. So again, I'm Molly, the archivist for Brooklyn Museum. I'm going to give you the briefest introduction to the museum's archives. You can see our reading room on the bottom right in the photo. Then I'm going to give a virtual tour of an exhibition that is currently on view, Jeffrey Gibson, When Fire is Applied to a Stone, It Cracks, to which I contributed. I'll be discussing the ethical considerations taken to display materials from the archives. And then I'll round off my portion with a kind of virtual reading room archives table so that you can read and investigate some fascinating documents from the archives that you could possibly use in your instruction. Here are the overarching themes of my presentation and activity that I want you to keep in mind. What are valid histories? Just because something is authentic does not mean it is the only truth. The importance of being specific about Native nations to avoid generalizations. The necessity of centering Native people and culture. How archival material can be used and new in different ways. Investigating historical subjectivity. Who has had the power and authority to portray Native American histories and what was their bias? I want to stress that I am not an expert. I began to learn about Native American history only through carrying through these materials in the archives over the past few years and coming across painful narratives that can be challenging to discuss. So I want to say that to recognize that we are all learning and unlearning. So what are the archives? On the top right, you can see lots of boxes, which are full of paper. Our archives are primarily institutional records, the work that was done by the people who worked in the museum, from the audiovisual department to visitor services. The materials are organized in collections, which are a discrete group of records bound together by their source, material, or subject. Most of the processed, meaning worked on by an archivist, process collections, most of the process collections are curatorial records and curators' papers. Everything from general administration to exhibition planning documents. So how do you find out what is in an archives? You search the finding aids. What is a finding aid? Most people don't know. Just as books have catalog records, archival materials have finding aids, which generally provide an overview of the material, the range of dates covered, how much material there is, among other information. You can check out more about the Brooklyn Museum's archives and read the finding aids by going to bit.ly/bcam archives, and that will also be in the chat. The Gibson Exhibition is on view currently at Brooklyn Museum until January 10th, and I hope this presentation inspires you to come see the exhibition in person. Jeffrey Gibson is a contemporary artist and MacArthur genius. He is of Choctaw and Cherokee descent. The exhibition is organized in 3 galleries. Here is the first gallery. Gibson chose objects from the museum's American and Arts of the Americas collections, placed them in dialogue with his own work to present a range of art historical traditions, illuminating the role they play in shaping his practice. Gibson sees himself on a continuum of Indigenous art, a category he regards as modern, innovative, and global, a living culture reflected in vibrant communities active across the continent. What is so striking and powerful about the exhibition, what you and your students would see in person, is the seamless continuity of Native American artistry, craftsmanship, techniques, and materials, really showing that traditions are ongoing, occurring today, not fixed in the past. Some of the source nations and tribes whose work is on display include Kanza, Kaw, Arapaho, Seminole. The jacket and dress in the middle of my slide are my favorite items. There is also Haudenosaunee, Zuni, Cochiti, and others. Gibson encourages visitors to rethink long-held preconceptions about Native American art and notions of monolithic cultural identity. You can see the walls are painted with a bright mural. The colors are celebratory and are meant to honor the makers who are represented in the exhibition, many of whose names we do not know. The resource room is the 3rd room of the exhibition, and it was curated by Dr. Christiane Crouch, Associate Professor of History at Bard College. She conducted extensive research in the museum's archives to show the broader stories of the collection items on display, focusing on drawing out items from the Stuart Kulin archival collection. Stuart Kulin was the museum's curator of ethnology from 1903 to 1929, and an ethnologist devoted to the study of the material culture of mankind, who traveled the world purchasing and commissioning items for the museum. He documented his collecting expeditions in 31 bound volumes, from which Dr. Crouch selected photographs, maps, and paintings. The material on view centers Indigenous subjects and cultures, rejecting the exclusion and erasure of Indigenous histories and stories. Instead, the displays reflect the continuity and endurance of Indigenous communities and artists. Our aim with these cases is to return the focus to Native people, thereby muting Kulin's voice, as his firsthand accounts are exhaustively represented in the archives. And we do this especially because Kulin and his contemporaries, their practices reinforced a culture of dying indigeneity that legitimized federal projects, ensuring that Native people would be seen as vanishing by most Americans. Peeling away the intrusive and distorted layers of Anglo-American expectation, we want you to read these records instead for how they witness communities and makers rejecting the colonial gaze, rejecting the imposition of categories they found meaningless or irrelevant, and look instead for moments where Indigenous people's understandings of themselves as makers leaps off the page. Institutional practices often alienated and distanced Native communities from culturally significant objects. And so by having representations of makers in the exhibition, we hope to offer possibilities to recover voices and self-representation of the subjects whose presence in the archives has previously been overlooked, used as illustrations instead of honored as unique people. Now that I have just shared some photographs with you, I want to explain that I follow the Protocols for Native American Archival Material, which is an incredible document that assists archivists and cultural heritage stewards with suggested best practices for ethically stewarding archival materials about, by, and of Native Americans. There is a very fraught and ugly history of photographs of Native Americans being taken and used without their consent to further racist ideologies that were actively harmful, such as the forced removal of children from their families, to obliterate their language, culture, beliefs, and society. As we heard from the speakers yesterday, in North America, some of these practices of forced removal of children ended as recently as the 1970s and 80s. So displaying a photograph of a person who is Native American has a complicated history. And as an archivist, I must be considerate in building relationships to seek guidance and input from Native nations and tribes in order to build trust and break the cycle of harmful practices. So for every source nation or tribe whose ancestor is in a photograph that we wanted to display, I wrote letters asking for further information, permission to display the photograph, and a wish to continue to build our relationship. I also informed them of all of the material in the Brooklyn Museum's archives that is about their people. Only one nation did not want their ancestors included, particularly because one of the photographs was actually offensive. Sacred ceremonial attire was being worn incorrectly, and I was completely ignorant of this because I'm not an expert. Other nations were excited to continue building our relationships, as many of them have worked with the museum before, particularly with Nancy Rossoff, our Arts of the Americas curator. I displayed this didactic that is in the that was in the exhibition and is in its entirety because it was previously included in a booklet that, because of safety precautions, is no longer in the gallery. Now for the activity on Padlet. You can find the link to the site in the chat. So this is the activity in which I'm trying to emulate the experience somewhat of being in the reading room doing archival research. For the first iteration of this workshop, I had selected folders and boxes of materials for teachers to peruse. This time I selected a handful of documents that I found especially compelling from different collections, the citations in the caption. In general, the structure of conducting research in archives is that you, the researcher, selects specific material, and that material is brought to you by the archivist. Rarely, if ever, do archivists do the research on behalf of researchers for many reasons, including gatekeeping and generally being understaffed. I am the only archivist at Brooklyn Museum. While I can wax poetic on every document that I selected, we're going to have about 7 minutes for you to just read and reflect the documents. I want you to choose an item that you could use in your classroom, comment on the document about why you chose it, explaining how you might use it with your students. Please add your name to your comment. I'm gonna pull it up. Or you can locate an example of historical bias. Is the statement based on facts or a subjective interpretation? So again, I'm gonna give you about 5-7 minutes to read and explore the documents. You can click on them to make them larger, and then you can click again, open new window, to see them even closer. So I hope everyone is getting to read the documents. So if you're having trouble reading the documents, you just click the link that we have in the chat, and that'll take you to the website. And the documents should be live on the website, and you can click on them. Again, to access the documents, you click the hyperlink in the chat to go to the Padlet, which is a website. I'm already seeing some comments roll in, so please keep adding. Yes, and fantastic to include in a DBQ. I remember that as someone who is New York State public school educated. The comment box on the Padlet is the small icon at the bottom right of each little pad. It's a gray icon with a number next to it. So earlier in my presentation, I had talked about the importance of being specific and avoiding generalizations. One of the two generalizations that I would like to point out is in the Native American cards. This was an activity that the educators at Brooklyn Museum had done, I believe in the late 70s. What's the citation? Yeah, 1978. And you can see the Plains card is actually depicting what you can see in the Gibson exhibition is Seminole. And Seminole peoples are from Florida and southeastern United States region. And they were, again, forced to leave their homelands and move towards the plains. But again, generalizations are harmful because you are erasing their individual identity and unique expression of their culture. Also, the Southwest Desert Shelter to the left is actually an ancient site of Chaco Canyon that I was really fortunate to visit last summer. So when we are when we're not specific enough, we can really lose the meaning and nuance that is so important for our students to learn. Let me just pull out some comments. The Susan Billy is an artist who was included. It's this image. And I just love these photographs, this series of photographs. She was an artist whose work was on display in a 1991 exhibition, A Dialogue with Tradition. And she was part of the Artist in Residence program, and the photographs depict her with her works. And in the folders in the archives about the exhibition, there is correspondence and other information exchanged with Susan Billy. I am loving everyone's comments that are pouring in. So I just want to wrap up the activity, and you will have access to this Padlet afterwards. And I'm going to share. My screen again. So in closing, I want to remind us all that there are 574 federally recognized Indian nations in the United States. So much of American life and culture has been passed down to us by people who were outsiders with a racist agenda to dispossess and frankly commit cultural genocide. This erasure and denial of sovereignty has been deadly, and it continues today. I suggest reading up on the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and No More Stolen Sisters movement that is very powerful and occurring today. This is one of the many reasons why we must discuss Native Americans in the present. This needs to change, and I hope one way change will come about is by how you as educators teach students about Native Americans. history and culture today. We need to avoid universalizing Native experience and speak specifically in our area of the Lenape in Brooklyn, of the Canarsie, of the people whose descendants still look back to this land as their home, not as Eastern woodland peoples, but people who are now living in Oklahoma, Wisconsin, and Ontario, whose ancestors lived on this very land for thousands of years, the Lenape. So thank you all for your attention and engagement. I hope my presentation was useful to you, and you can please feel free to email me. And with that, I'll now hand it over to Michael Reback, Senior Museum Instructor and Teacher Services Coordinator here at Brooklyn Museum. Thank you.
Thank you, Molly. And hello, okay. So hopefully you can all see my screen all right. I am just gonna name that I've never had such a large group. There's like about 100 of you. I'm a little nervous. Thank you all for being here and bearing with me. So my name is Michael Reback. I am the Teacher Services Coordinator at the Brooklyn Museum. My pronouns are he or they. I want to just start by thanking you all for coming tonight, and also by acknowledging what a bizarre and difficult time this is, especially for teachers. I know things are chaotic and tiring right now, and I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us tonight. For my session, I'm going to share some artworks from the Brooklyn Museum's collections related to Native American history and culture, and some ideas for how you could teach from them. I'll sort of start by doing a quick overview of a few different pieces, and then we'll spend the last 20 minutes or so doing a deeper dive into one series of works together. Just a quick note that I'll be asking folks to write responses to some questions a little bit later on. You can do this on your computer if you'd like to, but if you'd rather use pen and paper, you might want to just grab that now. So before I sort of dive in, just want to quickly share some ways that you and your schools can connect with our work. So I'm a member of the school programs team at the Brooklyn Museum, and like many of you, we've been working very hard to adapt our programming to virtual learning. And we're excited to have some great offerings this year. So first, we have virtual gallery visits. These are thematic educator-led virtual sessions that last about an hour. And can focus on anything from like arts of ancient Egypt to contemporary art and gender to everything in between. Next, we have school partnerships. So these are slightly more in-depth, multi-session, customized experiences. These are really all about educators from our team collaborating with teachers in a school to make sure the experiences really align well with the curriculum. And then of course we have teacher workshops like this one. So we have a really exciting roster this year. I want to quickly just shout out Art Exchange. So this is a program I run. It's a free program specifically for arts teachers. Charlie will send a link in the follow-up email after this program with more information. Please share it with your colleagues. We're accepting applications now through mid-November. And if you have any questions about these programs, please just shoot me an email. I'm happy to share more info or connect you with other folks. So now I want to just quickly share some artworks from the museum's collections that relate to the topics we're discussing today. These are all in your booklet that you received, along with links to each object's page on the online collections database that has more information and more images. So don't worry about sort of remembering all the details. I'm going to go kind of quick. I mostly just want to share some of the different ways that I think about using these resources when teaching students about Native American history and culture. So there are a few different kinds of categories that I think about. The first one is artworks that have representations of Native Americans, but are not made by Native Americans, right? They're made by non-Indigenous artists. If you've been to basically any museum, you've probably seen things like this, representations of Native Americans created by white men. Because these kinds of images are so common, I think it's really helpful to look at them with students and build a critical vocabulary for reading them, considering things like historic bias or sort of visual propaganda, right? That said, it's important to be very intentional when framing these discussions and explicit about who made the work and why they made it. So this example that you see here is by Edward Hicks. It's called A Peaceable Kingdom. You can see the detail in the background, William Penn entering into a treaty with the Lenape. So that combined with the scene in the foreground is supposed to evoke this narrative of like peaceful coexistence and diplomacy, even though we know that is ahistorical. That is not, it erases a lot of the history of how the Lenape were treated by settlers. Another artwork I use for this quite a bit is this painting by Albert Bierstadt. So Bierstadt was one of the first artists to travel west during westward expansion and kind of visualize this idea of manifest destiny in these larger than life paintings. This one's about 6 feet tall. It's very large. So here, Indigenous people are depicted vaguely using stereotypical imagery and are tiny compared to this huge, majestic landscape, right? My personal interpretation has always been like Bierstadt is depicting indigenous people as something small and easy for settlers to eventually conquer. Again, that's just my interpretation. So again, if you're using works like these, it's really important to present them alongside accurate historical info and to make sure that students understand the full context. It can be a great opportunity to unpack with students the idea that images are not neutral. They can convey particular points of view, and sometimes those points of view are harmful. So the next category I'm going to talk about really briefly is historic Native American art, which can be a great way to offer sort of counter narratives and help students better understand Indigenous perspectives and cultures throughout history. So this example is a Lenape bowl. The Brooklyn Museum has a small number of Lenape objects, including this wooden bowl, which likely would have been passed down between generations. I wanted to highlight this work in particular, as it will be the focus of an upcoming installation focused on Lenape-Hoking, or the Lenape homeland. So stay tuned. One other work that I wanted to share in this category are the ledger drawing. So during westward expansion, settlers, as we all know, settlers fought, displaced, and killed huge numbers of Indigenous people. The ledger book drawings showcase moments from this time period from an Indigenous perspective. There are a number of these in the museum's collection. They're all great. This one, which as you can see, shows a settler getting hit with an axe, is my personal favorite. And the last category I want to quickly talk about is contemporary Native American art, which I think is just so useful as a teaching tool. So many Indigenous artists today are thinking explicitly about the kinds of issues we're discussing in this workshop, such as historic bias, and are working to correct and reclaim narratives about Native American history and culture. Teaching from contemporary Native American art is also a great way to remind students that Indigenous cultures still exist. Harking back to something Molly brought up and a theme that came up in yesterday's session, just making sure that Native American communities are not relegated to the past and making sure students know that they continue to grow and adapt. So this, of course, is an installation shot from Jeffrey Gibson's show. One of the things I love about this exhibition is that Gibson is really playing around with all the different kinds of objects that I've been talking about over the last few minutes, creating this really kind of richly multi-layered, playful exhibition that asks, I think, really great questions about how Indigenous people are represented in art and museums and contemporary culture at large. One last note before I move on. If you're in Brooklyn or in the Brooklyn area, almost everything I've mentioned so far is on view at the Brooklyn Museum right now, and we are officially reopened. So if you are comfortable going to a museum, I would strongly recommend going and checking them out. They're all on the 5th floor. So now we're going to pivot a little bit and focus on one series of works by an artist named Wendy Redstar. Just a quick note, because there's so many of us, rather than trying to have an open-ended discussion, as I usually would during a workshop like this, I'm going to talk through sort of how I would engage students with this work. There will be a few interactive components throughout, and then we'll also hopefully have a little time at the end for an independent activity. I also just want to quickly kind of clarify, we're deviating a bit by focusing on Wendy Redstar from our theme of Native Americans in New York. Redstar grew up on a Crow reservation in Montana and currently lives in Portland, so she's not a New York artist, but her work speaks really powerfully to a lot of the broader themes we're discussing today, and in my experience, students find it very engaging. So I'm hoping it'll be sort of helpful for you as a teaching tool. So with that, so Charlie is going to drop a link in the chat to a Google Photos album This album has just 5 works by Wendy Redstar. What you can do is sort of click on one. In the top right corner, there's a plus, a magnifying glass with a plus on it that'll let you zoom into the image. And then when you're done looking, you can go back. But while you're looking, I want you to just jot down some details that stand out to you in these works. It could be anything you notice, anything that really stands out to you. And I'll give you about 2 minutes just to sort of look independently, and then we'll come back together. So yeah. All right, so if folks just want to take a few more seconds to look through the works, jot down any other details that stand out to you, then we can come back together. All right, so I'm gonna just ask, so I asked you to sort of write down details that you notice, look through those notes that you took and pick maybe 2 or 3 words that sort of stand out to you or that you feel like you know, really capture something about the works that you were just looking at. Just 2 or 3. And then we're gonna try something new for me. Charlie's gonna drop a link in the chat to a poll. So you'll click that link, it'll open up for a space for you to enter your 2 or 3 words. Then once you've entered them, you can come back here and we'll sort of see everyone's responses in real time. And hopefully it'll work. So once you're done adding your words, you can come back and you'll see we are building a word cloud. So words that pop up more frequently in your responses will be larger, but this will also give us sort of just an overview of things that stood out to people. This is my first time trying this with this prompt, so I'm curious to see if there's a lot of overlap with words. But I'm kind of loving this. So I see a few things that are starting to kind of rise to the top. Ermine, so they're, I may be pronouncing that wrong, but that's a material that Wendy Redstar has labeled. Warrior, feather, powerful. I see kicked ass is on there. I will say that if you show these works to students, they will always find that quote, the one part where she uses that phrase. I don't know how. It's like they just go straight to it. Annotations is coming to the top. Red ink, contextualization. These are so great. All right, so I think we're about done. So thank you all for entering your observations. And yeah, I would absolutely agree with all of these. And I love that you sort of picked a mix of specific details that you saw. So for example, feathers and red ink, as well as some sort of like zooming out, thinking about the series as a whole. So contextualization, powerful, are a couple that stand out to me. Pride is one. This is so great. Thank you. So yeah, so again, just if I was showing this work to students, I would give them a little time to sort of explore independently, share details that they see, usually in sort of open discussion format. And then I would usually ask just a couple follow-up questions. One that I like to ask is, what kinds of annotations do you see? So they usually point out like, oh, I see these red marks. But this is a question that can just help them look a little bit more closely and really start to unpack all the different types of annotations, all the type of information Wendy Redstar is including. So that includes labels of like what materials are or what things mean, word bubbles with people's names in them, quotes or stories about the sitters. There's a lot of really, really dynamic information that she includes. The other sort of follow-up question I like to ask at this point is, what does the red text remind you of? One thing that I will say, the first time I taught this to kids, I just assumed everyone would say like corrections on a test. Apparently a lot of younger students don't have that association. So I usually share that with them. But in my experience, we also get a lot of kind of other ideas, other associations that people have with the color red. So things like blood, passion, violence, luck, like all come up sometimes. So just to share a little bit more context, so I mentioned before, Wendy Redstar is a contemporary artist. She's Crow. And the sort of genesis of this series is that she was doing research specifically on medicine crow and came across these images. And others. She came across a bunch of images like this. So you'll see on the left and in the center, two of the sort of original black and white images she found. As she continued doing research, she also found these images sort of in circulation in surprising places. The one that sort of stands out to me the most, all the way on the right, you can see one of the images has been used on an Honest Tea label. This is true, and I was shocked when I learned this. The title of this tea is First Nation Peppermint. And they used this image with just like no context about it at all. So again, if I was doing this with students at this point, I might encourage them to sort of pause, and rather than thinking about Wendy Redstar's work, think about these primary sources, these photographs that she discovered and was sort of working with, right? So questions like, who do you think took these? When did they take them? Why did they take them? Can all elicit really good conversation. So actually, let me go back. Or no, we can go that. Sorry. So Charlie is going to drop another link in the chat. So I'd like for you to just sort of think about this question now that you've seen the original photographs and you've seen Wendy Redstar's kind of variations on them with the annotations. How do her annotations change the photos? You're welcome to just take a minute to think about that. And then when you click the link, a little text box will open and you can just enter, a sentence or two in response to this question. So feel free to take another minute if you're still typing. But the responses that people added are now on another one of these polls. So instead of doing a word cloud, This time we just sort of have the full responses scrolling, so you can kind of just get again, a snapshot of some of the things that people were thinking about in terms of how the annotations change the images. So I'm going to read a couple just as they sort of scroll through. I encourage you to just read as they come up. They add inner life and context. They provide context and insight. The annotations make the images feel more current and human. The annotations are rewriting or unwriting of a dominant stereotypical narrative. It's as if someone is speaking to me through the photo, speaking for the photograph person who cannot speak for themselves. I notice more details and think about the stories, the context, the reasons behind their inclusion. Yeah, I love that one. And one thing I want to highlight is that it's also making you sort of wonder about the story of these photographs, right? And wonder about the sitters. Add layers extra of information, not in the photo, questioning the act of interpretation and authenticity. Oh, these are all so good. One person said busy, that's true. They show me what I don't know and make me question how I see them. Connects the past with the present. They create a new work, a diagram, as well as commentary. These are all awesome. So I'm going to leave this up for a minute in case people want to just sort of continue seeing how people responded to the annotations. While that's scrolling, I'm just going to share a little bit more information about the photographs. So as Wendy Redstar sort of dug a little deeper, she learned a little bit more of the context. These photographs were taken by an artist named Charles Milton Bell. He was a prominent photographer in DC who took a lot of photographs of sort of official guests of the federal government, including a lot of indigenous leaders who sort of came through DC. So these particular photographs were from an 1880 peace delegation attended by a number of Crow leaders. One of the things that Redstar was thinking about as she was working on this series, one of the things Redstar was thinking about is that these photographs in a lot of ways kind of strip a lot of context away from these men and from the time period, and they have the potential to kind of float without much meaning attached, right? They can be challenging to read. One example that she pointed out in an artist talk that I saw her give, this isn't like daily wear, but rather outfits and regalia that they wore on a special official diplomatic delegation, right? So some people may be tempted to say like, oh yeah, they're like wearing Native American dress, but you know, this isn't like everyday outfit. This is you know, special clothing, special regalia they were wearing. So I want to just share one more quote. So this is a quote from Wendy Redstar. I'm going to read it out loud. I encourage you to follow along with me. I want people to realize that the images of Medicine Crow are more than just a handsome Native man. The images represent a human being, a reservation era chief, the forming of the Crow Indian Reservation, the loss of Crow lands, the changing of a people, the resilience of a culture. So she's really thinking about ways to sort of take these photos and bring all of this context, all of this information, all of these voices to the forefront, right? So, okay, how are we doing on time? So the last thing I wanted to do is just sort of share an activity. So I've done variations of this activity with students before. This is one that I thought could work maybe well for virtual learning. And we'll just have like a couple minutes to do this, but I'd love to ask everyone to find a photograph that is personally meaningful to you, and just think for a second about what it means to you, right? Then imagine that someone 100 years from now found this photo. What would you want them to know about it? What kinds of annotations would you make to help them understand its importance and its meaning? So this could be a photo, like a physical photo that you have nearby. This could be a photo on your phone. But we can maybe just take like 2 minutes just to give you sort of a taste of this activity. folks just want to take 30 more seconds, then we're going to come back together. And I'm sorry we don't have more time. Per usual, I'm going over. All right, hopefully everyone at least got a chance to find a photo, start thinking about how you might annotate it. Hopefully you enjoy this activity and this talk. So I want to just say a few more things. So just some final thoughts. As I said at the beginning, I think that Wendy Redstar's work really resonates with a broad age range. I've done a sort of iteration of this lesson with students as young as 4th grade, all the way up through adults, like right now. So I think they're very, very effective teaching tools. And then in terms of that final activity, I think it can be adapted in a lot of different ways. So for example, if you have a little more time and want to sort of get students thinking about photography as well, they could take a self-portrait and think about how they would annotate that, or they could take a photograph of like meaningful objects that they have and annotate something like that. And then if you really want to extend it even further, there are free apps to actually annotate images. So they could actually make their annotations and maybe upload them somewhere like Google Classroom. One that I found was Notable. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but it's a free app for iPhone and iPad. And there's lots of other ones like it. And then just one last thing. So I know some folks are maybe not as familiar with teaching from works of art. I will say teaching from a work of art is very similar to how you may teach students to like closely read a text or analyze a primary source. But in case you just want to like learn a little bit more, have a framework to help you implement something like this, there are 2 frameworks that I would recommend checking out. One is visual thinking strategies. This is a very popular, very easy to implement technique for having open-ended discussions around works of art. The one that I prefer a little bit and that I think works a little better for arts integration scenarios is called the Pyramid of Inquiry. It's developed by my colleague Nicola Giardina while she was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I can actually share an article with Charlie to share with you all after this if you want to learn more about that. But it's, again, a very flexible tool and pretty easy to implement. And with that, I think I'm done. But thank you all so much. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you found some inspiration for teaching, and please feel free to email me if you have any questions about Brooklyn Museum programs or anything else. And with that, I am going to hand it back to Jen and Julia.
Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you everyone for all of your listening and all of your participating in these like different virtual ways that we're trying out. I know I think I can speak for those of us who have been working on this. It's hard to think about doing things virtually when we love doing things with all of you in person. But I also know that so many of you working as teachers are looking for creative ways to do things in the classroom right now. And so I hope that some of the things we're trying out with all of you today can also just be useful as techniques that you might take away and try elsewhere. I am going to go ahead and share my screen. And I'm going to talk a little bit about using primary sources to analyze historic bias. We've looked at a lot of different types of sources, and I really like the distinction that I've seen come out in what Molly and Michael have talked about, and also in the chat, folks looking at Padlet and looking at the different works of art that that Michael was showing, and thinking about material that shows us Indigenous peoples speaking for themselves versus people speaking on their own behalf. And something that I know we often face ourselves working with archival material from the collections at the Brooklyn Public Library is that much of it doesn't let Indigenous people speak for themselves. And I know that this is a problem that we constantly run into in textbooks as well and in other pedagogical materials. And so we've spent a lot of time thinking about how do we have conversations about that with students, and how do we bring that material into conversation that that is created by Indigenous communities. And so we're going to work through an activity that we have put together on using primary sources to analyze historic bias. We'll share a lesson plan for this later. If it hasn't already been shared in the chat, we'll share it at the end. And this is something that we would usually do in 2 parts, and we already did 1 part. So we found that it's really important to ground this in a conversation about the vocabulary that we use, and so that's why we did that icebreaker at the beginning. You may want to do that very differently with your students depending on whether you're working online or offline. And depending on the age of your students, Julia talked about some different ways for differentiation, and you may definitely want to spend more time having conversation about the terms. But the goal of that first part of this activity is really just to come to a common place, a common understanding of the words available for talking about historic bias in primary source material. And then part 2 that we're doing today is really diving into source analysis, and we will get to do some group work. We all love group work. We're going to use breakout rooms in a few moments to do that. And so we're going to work in small groups. I'm going to give you some instructions on what we'll be doing. And we're going to use a set of prompts to analyze primary sources and talk about the historic bias that we see and think about how that complicates what we're learning from these sources. And then I'll explain kind of what comes after that when we come back from breakout rooms. You will be assigned to a breakout room. Charlie, in a few moments, when I tell him it's time to go, will send us to breakout rooms. And if he hasn't already shared it, he's going to put a link in the chat, which you can see on your screen. The 2 things that you really need are that link, and you also need to watch when you get sent to your breakout room for the breakout room number. So as Zoom is shuffling you around, you'll see a little pop-up on your screen that says, you are heading to breakout room number, whatever. So watch for that number, grab this link. If you don't see it, chances are really good someone else in your breakout room has seen it, and you're in the clear. Really just one of you needs this. But once you then get to your breakout room, you'll be at this kind of landing page from the link that Charlie's going to share. And then you can just click. This is a Google Doc. You'll click on the link for your own breakout room, and that will take you to a document that allows you as a group to work together in your breakout room to analyze a primary source. So examine that primary source together and respond in the Google Doc. You can type in that Google Doc to the prompts that you're provided with. I did want to mention that the prompts we're using are prompts we took from 4th grade New York City curriculum. We do actually find that these prompts some of them are difficult for some 4th grade groups and work very well for much older students. So if you wanted to do this with your students, feel free to change them as needed. We'll take 10 minutes in the breakout rooms. Don't worry if you don't respond as a group to every single prompt. Focus on having really good conversation. We'll be talking about whose perspective we see in the source, what other perspectives there might be and why, whose voices are heard, whose voices are omitted, what evidence we see and how we might judge the quality of that evidence, and then how specific groups or individuals are portrayed in that account. I want to just remind everyone of a few things here. As we go into our breakout rooms, we'll be working with groups of people that we might not know. And I want to acknowledge that talking about these issues and looking at some of these sources can be really difficult. So it's important to be sensitive and to respect the thoughts and feelings of other people and to voice our opinions in a way that really shows care for each other and for the learning that we're all doing. If you feel uncomfortable in your breakout room, you should see a little button to call the host for help. So feel free to use that to ask our Zoom host, who's Charlie, to join your conversation. And the link that you need once more is on the screen, and I'm sure in the chat already. And so I'm going to pass things over to Charlie now to send us off to breakout rooms. We have 10 minutes to spend some time looking at a source and thinking about the perspectives and evidence and historic bias that we find there. Are we ready to go, Charlie? And we were all looking at a lot of different sources as we were in our separate breakout rooms and using the same prompts to reflect on a lot of different types of material. So if we were doing this in a classroom with a group of students, the thing we would actually do next is in teacher lingo, we would do a jigsaw. And for those of you who don't use that word to talk about organizing people, what we would do is we would actually rearrange our groups. So we would now sit in groups with someone who had a source different than us, and we would have students compare their answers and compare the similarities and differences they came across when looking at two very different primary sources, and work together to find common issues that they see coming up in terms of representation and bias, and also to understand the differences and how people can be given the opportunity to have their own voice. How we would do that in real life on paper is with a worksheet that has a Venn diagram for writing similarities and differences between sources, or you could dream up another comparison tool. This could actually work in Zoom if we reassigned everyone to different breakout rooms. But I myself felt that it might be a little disorienting to shuffle off to a second set of breakout rooms and dive back into another short but deep conversation. So we're skipping that part of the activity, the second kind of talking with someone else about the answers that they found for their source. But what we would do to then wrap up our activity is think about this final question of why are there different versions of events, and what impact does this have on our ideas of truth and historical accuracy? And I would love for you to sit with this question for a minute and share any thoughts, any responses that you have in the chat. And also thinking back to the vocabulary that we started with, words like colonialism and interpretation and perspective and power dynamics, and how can we use those words in talking about why and helping our students understand why we see different versions of events and what impact this has on truth and historical accuracy. So feel free if you have any thoughts, any responses to that. No need to share, but if you have anything you'd like to share, feel free to put it in the chat. And I'm going to ask one of my colleagues to drop a link in the chat to the lesson plan for this activity. Thank you so much, Charlie. That lesson plan includes instructions for doing what we have just done. And it includes the vocabulary terms that we used in our icebreaker. And it also includes all 7 of the primary sources that we used for for this activity today. And thank you so much, folks, for sharing things in the chat. And I love that idea of the parable about the elephant and different people having a different idea of what the animal is. And I see that there were discussions about historiography of the document, context of when it was written navigates the perspective. Absolutely. And I think that I love that comment because I don't know that I got to talk about historiography when I was in grade school. And I think that this would be a terrific activity for starting that conversation. Yeah, I love this idea, Lynn, of making sure to help students develop analytical and empathetic skills. There's so many great comments in the chat. Thank you all. Conversations about perspective and concepts of truth. And Mafa, your comment that history is written by the winners just really reinforces for me that idea of power dynamics that we talked about in our icebreaker. Yeah, what's a winner, hey? Thank you, Marie. Yeah. Colonialism hasn't won. It's a really important reminder. So I am going to pass things back to Caitlin. Our next thing to do is to touch on some of the questions that have come up today.
Okay, hi everybody. Again, my name is Caitlin. Just want to put my name up so that you all could be reminded. I was going to ask a few questions of our presenters today. Some of the questions that you all posed in the chat box throughout our session. So I was hoping to start with Molly. You had a few questions about Gibson's exhibition specifically. And the questions, Molly, for you are twofold. First, somebody observed that the statue in the first gallery when you first walk in used to be next to the parking lot. The question is, why did Gibson choose to bring it to the entrance of the exhibition? Do you know the answer?
I do. So yes, it is quite shameful that the sculpture, which is by Rumsey, it is titled, I believe it's titled Dying Indian. It's pretty shameful that it was back in the parking lot for years. And many people had remarked on that over the years. And Gibson did want to bring the statue back in. And there are so many aspects of the exhibition that I didn't get to touch on. But the mural behind the sculpture says, "I'm going to run with every minute I can borrow." And Gibson commissioned John Murray, who I believe that's his name, who is a bead worker in Montana, to, yeah, we can try to put those images up again, to create moccasins for the statue. And instead of the statue being a defeatist, again, dying indigeneity narrative, Gibson, you know, reclaims the statue as like survivance, as like the person depicted is going to keep on running with every minute they can borrow, despite, you know, as we were talking about yesterday, you know, despite the centuries of oppression, and, you know, really celebrating the sculpture for the resilience that Native American people have. And the moccasins were placed on the statue, and we're not sure whether or not they'll stay on there. So hopefully they will.
Could I add something quickly to that? Is that okay? I just want to add, when I heard Gibson talk about that work, I also heard him describe it sort of like museologically, like saying almost every museum has a work like this and none of them have any idea what to do with it. So I think in some ways he's also, in addition to everything Molly said, is also really thinking about how institutions present this problematic historical work and trying to kind of present an alternative, present an alternate take, offer a blueprint forward. Thank
you both. Another question related to the Gibson show is about the choice of color. Did Gibson specifically request or stipulate that the first room be painted in that kind of beautiful rainbow array, or what kind of symbolism perhaps was that supposed to represent?
Definitely. So both the entrance and the collection room has that really incredible, striking rainbow mural, and Gibson did design that himself, and then a team of painters executed it. It was amazing to watch it go up. The symbols are the symbols. The colors are meant to honor the makers and the people whose work is on display, and the semicircle is meant to be kind of a sunrise sunset that's continually occurring. I had a really great quote from Gibson about it, but I took it out of my presentation. But it's basically meant to symbolize the shift in how Native American artistry is talked about and discussed today. And yeah, I'm going to try to find that quote for you.
Great. Thank you so much, Molly. Hopefully we can share that in the chat. Somebody also had a question about the notion of the land acknowledgement. Can you perhaps explain that?
Definitely. So land acknowledgement, if you weren't able to attend yesterday's session, the importance and complications of acknowledging the people whose land you are on. So the original caretakers and stewards of the land where I am right now. I'm in Brooklyn, so it was the Lenape, commonly referred to as Delaware. And so when we begin a program or an event, we want to recognize, to work against the erasure of Native American experience and lives, to acknowledge that they were here, they come back here, and also the most important thing that was pointed out by Curtis yesterday is that it's not enough to just acknowledge the people whose land it was. You have to make a commitment to action and to engagement, and to not just saying something that sounds nice, that really makes yourself feel better. You need to go beyond that and try to engage with communities and share information. There's a lot to be said there. Anyone else want to chime in?
Well, I would recommend everybody, we will share the recording of yesterday's session at some point in the coming weeks. And we would encourage you to listen and watch, because it was extremely powerful for those of you that were not there to hear from the elders, to hear from the communities themselves that we are speaking of today. They said it so much more eloquently than we can. So I would encourage you to do that. I think that we're coming to a bit of a close now. I did want to let you all know that all the resources that we've referenced today should be shared in the booklet that was sent to you. We will also make sure to go through it ourselves to make sure that we've added a lot of the additional links that have been added through the chat if they aren't there already, in addition to a recording of this session and the PowerPoint presentation. So there'll be plenty of opportunities to revisit all the information that you've gathered today. In a wrap up, I'm just going to go through a few things. And again, apologies if you already saw this yesterday, but we wanted to highlight some upcoming events that we have on the docket at Brooklyn Museum and at the Center for Brooklyn History at Brooklyn Public Library. Again, CTLE eligible and really powerful programs. So we hope that you'll continue to follow us either through our prospective websites, on our email list, on our social media, and that you'll apply, or I should say register to attend some of these great programs. And again, we would be incredibly grateful for your insight and input into our evaluation survey. As we've all referenced, this is new for us. It's a whole new world. And you all are participating in some of our very first virtual professional learning seminars. So we would love to have your feedback. Your feedback through this evaluation survey is also your ticket to CTLE credit. If you need CTLE credit, then you must fill out this survey for us. That's kind of that is the bribe that we're putting out there. Please fill out the survey, and then you can enter your details at the end to receive CTLE credit, and we will actually email that certificate to you in the coming week. On behalf of Brooklyn Public Library Center for Brooklyn History and the Brooklyn Museum, I would like to thank you all again for attending. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.